Before they take over, I'd just like to, on behalf of TASA, say we acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So thank you.
Many thanks. I will share my screen. And how's that for everyone?
Mm-hmm.
All right, great. So welcome and many thanks for joining us today. And before I begin, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the unceded lands in which I'm meeting you today and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, but recognize that many of you are joining us from other lands near and far. So I won't repeat our title, but I will highlight at the onset that this is collaborative work that we're facilitating from the ANU. We're based at RegNet, the School of Regulation and Global Governance, and this is work that we've done with our Justice and Techno Science Lab. So if anyone would like to have a chat about what our setup's like, happy to do so, and I'd love to hear how others are collaborating during these COVID pandemic times. That said, this presentation is an extension of a piece we published in The Conversation last month in response to what everyone knows about the New South Wales Police Commissioner's kind of speculative suggestion to consider these consent apps in response to concerns around sexual assault. And it's actually based on a couple articles under review, both of which are much closer to publication than a month ago. And we very much look forward to sharing them when we can. And in the meantime, we're hoping this discussion can prompt a wider dialogue around with sociologists who have overlapping interests. I should say we're certainly not the only ones publishing on concerns around the digitization of sexual violence responses. Bridget Harris is doing some great work at QUT, for example. But I do want to take the opportunity to kind of plug that Renee is writing a book that will be an excellent resource on the history and range of anti-rape technologies and how they've been used over time, and some of the inequities embedded in their use, particularly some of the intersectional inequities, but I'll let her speak to that a little bit more in her part of the presentation. So just to give a brief overview of what we'll be talking about today, given that there's 3 of us involved in this particular project, we're going to try something ambitious, and I'm glad we have a small group so we can experiment, at least from my Zoom skills. So I'm basically going to serve as a bookend speaker, and that is I'll start and then I'll finish, and then Jenna and Renee will be speaking in the middle. And so at very least, if you're bored hearing from me, you can hear from others and there'll be some variation over the talk. So here's our overview. We'll do a background on the recent rise and growth of these apps. We'll map some of the common features and proposed uses of them, or proposed of them at least. Kind of a genealogy, a very short analysis of kind of the history and the patterns of problematic functions they put forth. And then discuss about whether or not and how they both confront and constitute forms of oppression in this space. Just to give some background, so you know, just a snapshot of the research approach we employed here. I won't go into too much depth, but just to give you some of the driving concerns that we did in asking, wanting to know more about these apps. So recognizing the longer and varied history of these apps and assault technologies, we wanted to see like how they're being presented in different contexts as a response to sexual violence. So what we'll be talking about today is most of the kind of global patterns we've seen, recognizing that there's definitely a need for further research in this space. Our conceptual frameworks have varied by the publication, but they're in dialogue with these emergent discussions that are happening around what an intersectional technoscience might look like. And I should say, Indigenous scholars are certainly at the forefront of this and have been for many, many years. And a lot of other people in STS are really just catching up about thinking of these forms of knowledge and how they get manifest in relational ways. So I do think that's important to acknowledge. And in terms of methods, just to briefly acknowledge that we've used a combination of intertextual analysis and walkthrough method. Happy to discuss those in Q&A if everyone wants to. But we're also drawing kind of, and this isn't formally in our methodology, kind of autoethnographic insights, having been approached by app developers to be experts who help them build the technology, and also as reviewers of funding bodies and government agencies that have asked us to come on and review applications in this space. So while that insight isn't formally in the analysis or drawn on as quote unquote data, it certainly gave us insights in terms of how we approached this project. So on that kind of overview, I will turn it over to Jenna to kind of discuss a little bit more. Oh, actually, no, I'm not. I'm going to keep going. See, don't trust my Zoom skills. So in terms of background, the recent rise of these apps can be traced to kind of three interrelated developments. And I'll go through the next two in just a second. But the first one is, which is interestingly linked to the Me Too movement itself, and renewed calls for conversations and very critical conversations about sexual violence and the power dynamics around sexual violence. Against this background, we've seen two developments, particularly in North America, but not exclusively. And that is strong encouragement and funding incentives from governing entities. So the first kind of premier one that can be traced as a key moment is the Obama administration launching the Apps Against Abuse Tech Challenge, which was to spark and encourage innovation in this space. Obviously, that wasn't a priority of the Trump administration. And then also UN Women have been huge backers in this space as well. There's also been pressure for organizations to develop more responsive approaches to harassment and assault in light of high-profile cases in which institutional actors have been found or suspected of being responsible. Many of these organizations are in the United States and are major universities, in fact. And so, but we're also seeing them rolled out in other corporate contexts, being deployed through human resources systems. And in short, they're really forming a part of a risk management strategy on their part. So if we look at these trends, it's perhaps not surprising that the recommendation of the consent app here in Australia emerged in a context where there were not only widespread calls for change in terms of handling sexual violence, but also growing scrutiny and pressure on organizations and institutions about where accountability lies. That said, there's this story that I've just given about the apps is certainly specific to the global north and particular dimensions and areas of the global north. Our research hasn't yet enabled us to dig deep in other contexts, but we do know, or at least picked up in our own research, that these are being deployed in aid and development contexts, and we still want to know how those grassroots organizations actually interface with those larger organizations in their deployment through development projects. And one really practical reason why these apps are growing in parts of the global south, at least based on our preliminary work, is that so many people are reliant on mobile phones for reliable internet access that it is a logical fit for reporting, especially if other access to other modes of reporting aren't available. So now I will stop speculating on that particular and turn it over to Jenna.
Awesome, thanks, Kate. So as Kate mentioned, our research focuses on North America, and this is just given available data and the location of most tech funding. However, these technologies are proliferating globally, typically developed by the private sector and financially backed by venture capitalists. Some were also created in consultation with government bodies like the UNDP and the World Bank. Eisenhut and their colleagues define 5 primary categories of apps, which we have extended to 6. Most combine these functions, but for the sake of clarity, we've parsed them out individually. So emergency tech offers immediate help to survivors right before, during, and after crisis situations. In contrast, used in anticipation of dangerous incidents, avoidance tech aims to prevent sexual violence. With Noonlight, for instance, users hold their finger on a button until they are safe, and if removed without entering a code, contacts are alerted. Education-oriented apps inform broader society on the prevalence, consequences, and illegality of sexual violence. They also offer survivors information related to assault, like that on consent and court processes. Other platforms compile and submit digital reports on incidents, and in a connected way, whether or not it's used for reporting, some collect and store digitized evidence on the incident, such as voice recordings and perpetrator characteristics. And lastly, supporting apps cater to the social, psychological, and bodily well-being of survivors, pointing them in the direction of locally accessible resources like mental health services. These technologies come in various formats and can be combined, including smartphone applications, internet pages and web-based forums, SMS, and wearable personal safety devices, such as microchip necklaces connected to an app. In select platforms, particular spaces and users are targeted, like the workplace, university and college campuses, and competitive sport. And in terms of costing structure, some are free of cost, like SafeView in Armenia, whereas others require subscriptions or a purchase of the app and are thus profit-oriented, like Spot AI. Thank you. When it comes to their features, sexual violence technologies are primarily valued for offering smart solutions that use machine learning, artificial intelligence, automated decision-making, and big data analysis. With Callisto, for example, digital records are held in escrow until their matching algorithm finds that at least 2 survivors identify the same repeat offender. And here on the slide, you'll see some screenshots from their website trying to visualize this. Geolocation tracking is also prominent, suggesting that surveillance is a key element. GPS details can be recorded and sent, especially in cases of stalking prevention. Be Safe, for instance, features a follow me home option in which pre-selected guardians watch users travel through a potentially concerning area via live streaming video while simultaneously sending the user's location. Similarly, JDoe offers hotspot map visualizations of areas with high rates of incident reporting. Emergency alerts are another prominent feature, sending notifications to pre-selected designated contacts or emergency response personnel when personal safety is compromised. Educational features provide various types of valuable information that enhance survivors' understanding of violence and potential options moving forward, such as restorative justice or not taking action at all. In a connected way, applications like Spot offer workplace training on a collection of topics related to misconduct. Moreover, the digitized timestamped records of assault are described as secure. This involves data protection measures such as encryption and blockchain, as well as maintaining users' confidentiality and anonymity. And lastly, the data collected from these records, as well as metadata from the use of the tech itself, can be anonymized and aggregated into reports that are shared with clients and partners. These reports provide a sense of how the tech is used, as well as information about recorded and unreported results and incidence rates. Thank you. Big tech frame and market their use as compensating for the many downfalls of offline solutions. Removing common barriers to reporting is one such claim. Features such as chatbots employed by apps like Australia's Hello Cass are to overcome the discomfort, fear, hesitancy, and emotional trauma of reporting to a human, especially to problematic and intimidating authorities such as police or human resources. In doing so, the rate of reporting will ideally increase and thereby make it easier for a group of survivors to file a lawsuit together, which is often framed as more feasibly positioned to prosecute offenders. Ease of access is an additional barrier of reporting framed as being thwarted. Given that resources and reporting are easier to locate and access on digital devices, survivors are not limited by scheduling conflicts and mobility restrictions. Another benefit is better and more actionable evidence, which is particularly appealing for lawyers in case building. More detailed information about the assault is to be gathered in greater quantities and in systematic, scientifically tested ways, like standardized cognitive interviewing that avoids leading questions. Doing so supposedly enhances the quality and reliability of evidence as compared to traditional reporting to a person, which is notoriously troubled by human error and prejudice. Report compilation is thus marketed as unbiased and neutral. Reporting apps and Me Too bots, furthermore, are supposed to be survivor-centric. They are supposed to empower the survivor by enabling personal choice and control in how to handle the assault. Responses to sexual violence post-incident are also supposed to be more effective and actionable. Efficiency is enhanced by automation, centralized and streamlined consolidation of reporting, as well as direct transfer of information to relevant personnel like Title IX coordinators, law enforcement, and higher ups in companies. As such, big tech claims that there are less challenges with finding and processing information, thereby encouraging institutions to respond and in a more timely manner. In another way, these technologies serve as a deterrent to deviant behavior. Audible and flashing alarms can alert others around you if you're feeling threatened or in the midst of an assault. Physical deterrents, such as Japan's invisible ink stamp, which are featured on this slide, are framed as enabling survivors to mark assailants and includes a black light for revealing the stamp. Sociocultural deterrence manifests through education campaigns, emphasizing the unacceptability of assault, and this links to claims that their use can spur broader sociocultural structural changes, given that these digital platforms reinforce in one way or another that sexual violence is A, commonplace, and B, will not be tolerated.
Okay, so we'll shift over to Renee. So that's the marketing kind of side of what big tech's proposing. And Renee's going to dig a little bit deeper into kind of like the actual genealogy of this technology and some problematic patterns that we actually see in practice.
Yes, definitely want to emphasize those are large marketing claims. So one thing, before getting into that, one thing that I think it's important to note is that if we start talking about apps and AI and algorithms, this gives the impression that the technological response to violence is novel. However, the modern notion of anti-violence tech has existed since at least the 1960s, when inventors first began patenting objects to prevent, report, investigate, and punish sexual violence. So some of these are quite familiar. The earliest uses of the electronic monitor in the 60s included efforts to control men's whereabouts, men who had so-called dangerous sexuality. The rape kit was developed by feminist activists in the 70s as a techno-scientific reform to police practice to encourage them to take assault seriously. There's the infamous rape whistle or blue light telephones, both of which indulge in the racialized stranger danger rape myth that imagine violence as an external threat in the public sphere. But there's also an entire genre of bizarre wearable anti-rape devices that were patented alongside the women's liberation movement throughout the early 2000s. And so these objects took the form of cut-proof or locking undergarments and weaponized female condoms with jagged teeth that would lock onto assailants' bodies and serve as a mode of street justice. Some, like the one pictured here on the right, included a microcomputer and audio surveillance capabilities to identify and build cases against perpetrators. And this is a major theme that has carried on into apps against abuse today. So as Jenna noted, a more viable landscape for smart anti-rape technology began to form only after 2010, driven by advances in technology, miniaturization, and government calls for innovators to apply smart tech to the problem of sexual violence. Thus, in the past decade, we've seen a new wave of high-tech anti-violence products, and some classics have also gotten a facelift. So beyond reporting apps, these include prevention objects to thwart and enforce consent. Take, for example, commercial date rape drug tests like the SIP chip, and geolocating smart panic buttons like Always On. And in recent years, major hotel chains like Hilton and Marriott have mandated that all of their staff wear panic buttons in their North American properties. For investigating assault, we're now seeing a reform to the reform of the rape kit through development of proprietary rape kit tracking platforms like TrackKit and Truly. So survivors can use these and log on and geolocate evidence as it moves from their bodies to hospital to police to the crime lab. And then of course, there's punishment tech like the electronic monitor, which in recent years has received a biometric facelift. In addition to being affixed to offenders' bodies, GPS monitors like Scram have facial recognition scans, remote blood alcohol testing, and phone apps that allow probation officers to check in 24/7. So while much anti-violence tech seems novel, behind the scenes, it's really reshaping our social responses to violence in businesses, on college campuses, in the legal system, and as people simply go about their lives. And as legal and institutional authorities are increasingly excited to adopt new technologies in the so-called fight against violence, we should really pay close attention to what they enable and what they promote. Okay, so now turning back to the reporting apps, there are several high-level patterns that we should pay attention to. So first, these apps enable a focus on individual and short-term solutions. Relatedly, they obscure the salience of interlocking, structural oppressions, meaning the conditions that foster precarity and vulnerability to interpersonal and state violence. And in fact, state violence has not yet been addressed through any technology that I've come across so far. While often using the language of empowerment, inventors' designs embrace self-surveillance, monitoring, and self-discipline. They also rely on a single access analysis of gender, advancing an every woman discourse, and essentializing interventions, giving the illusion that there can ever be a one-size-fits-all solution, which of course always defaults to the needs of the most privileged. And because these are primarily for-profit technologies, commodification rends them an end versus an end or a means to the end of sexual violence. And throughout all of this, they're promoting and often actively funneling users into a criminal legal response. So while proponents maintain and sometimes even enshrine in law that anti-violence technology will address the needs of the most vulnerable and correct sites of injustice, our research raises serious concerns about embracing this techno-solutionism. Almost all of the technologies that we've examined speak to what Black feminists like Angela Davis, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Beth Ritchie have long cautioned, that simplistic theories of sexual violence and uneasy alliances with legal actors perpetuate structural racism and white supremacy. And we can see this baked into the design and affordances of the software, which conducts virtual interviews with survivors using law enforcement techniques, and then packages their responses into neat timestamp reports that's legible and primarily useful to HR, lawyers, and police, all while automating few meaningful opportunities to connect survivors with emotional, psychological, or financial resources. So this turn towards proprietary technology is further concerning because none of these interventions are really designed to dismantle or even remotely challenge structural inequality. And in the spirit of what Sarah Benet-Weiser calls pop feminism becomes the commodified end rather than a means to the end of sexual violence. Of the more than 125 anti-violence technologies I've examined, only a handful work to improve precarious people's access to material resources. And none of the technologies build in much needed race conscious affordances that could provide intentional support to those who are least likely to be believed, which we know are Black, brown, queer, trans, and low-income people, among others. So in light of prominent critiques from the feminist blogosphere about some of these objects, apps have started to offer superficial community support functions and provide only a cursory list of victim service providers. Sometimes they donate a portion of sales to an education initiative, though details are often vague. While raising awareness and education, are important, these are rarely the central purpose and often take a back seat to the more central affordances that emphasize punishment and encourage survivors to pursue cases in civil and criminal court. It's also worth noting that platforms that seem to garner the most buzz are those like Talk to Spot, whose AI conducts cognitive interviews with survivors. So Spot self-proclaims it's the gold standard in reporting because its AI is somehow completely free from bias. It ignores that the humans behind the app who receive those reports may still very much be not free from bias. So the apps like Spot appeal to the HR industry because they effectively pitch themselves as safeguarding institutions from negligence lawsuits and from the so-called silent survivors whose choice not to report is framed as a threat. So consider how the not me reporting AI turns the issue of accountability on its head, explaining that it's survivors in action, not the violence of perpetrators, that threatens profitability. So they claim, our deep experience in the space has led us to understand that misconduct is not an HR problem, it's a people problem. People are frozen in fear of speaking up and seeking help from their organizations, thus perpetuating unchecked repeat offenses, reducing workplace productivity, and ultimately causing high turnover and high legal costs that often go hand in hand with unpleasant media headlines. So in digging deeper, we can begin to see how instead of radically reimagined justice practices, much anti-violence tech serves corporate and legal gazes by disciplining survivor behavior according to the imagined needs of white, middle class, straight cisgender victims and white racialized institutions. In this way, the current spate of anti-violence technology is just the next high-tech iteration of the same old, same old. And with that, I will turn it back over to Kate to close us out.
Great, thanks so much, Renee. And again, Renee has studied this for quite some time, so thanks for sharing your insights from your other work as well. So I'm just going to conclude, and in the interest of time, I'm going to conclude fairly quickly because Renee's really touched on some of the questions of oppression and how they might emerge in this context. And so I won't repeat this and I'll just move on. We kind of wanted to leave with kind of 5 key points, some of which Renee's touched on, some of which our articles touch on a little bit more in depth. And so the first is really if we, and I should note they're all 5 interconnected across what we've found so far. So the first is like when deployed in organizational environments, these apps tend to reinforce the narrative that these technologies are necessary to catch individual perpetrators who are understood as kind of bad apples, particularly those who are repeat offenders. And Renee's highlighted why that's problematic. And actually one other dimension that we might highlight is the fact that it also draws attention to hostile environments that enable these things to happen. Second, the financialized imperatives, which Renee has also touched on, often mean the design of these technologies actually don't functionally cater to users' needs, and instead they're designed to maximize the collection of data so that it can be packaged and shared. So again, sometimes that could be potentially used for survivors, but in other cases it may not. And then related to that point, the design also fails to address the structural inequities that Renee's just highlighted, but also even survivors' ability to report or use these apps. So this came up in the discussion of the consent apps in Australia. Just because you download the app, it doesn't mean it's going to be used as prescribed due to forms of coercion, structural deterrence, perhaps like being out at a place where certain kinds of sexual activity wouldn't be deemed acceptable, or the relationships implicating the encounter or assault. In addition, just because one reports doesn't mean they can actually go through the process of following through on a legal action. And that's actually where, many experts highlight their quote unquote problems in the system. And that's if you choose to pursue that system, I should say. Not many survivors do not wish to. And fourth, as Renee mentioned, the pathways as presented by the apps, because they tend to emphasize formal legalized responses, they actually can actively foreclose possibilities for survivors, especially if deployed in an HR context, for example, what may be bound to your contractual obligations. We've also found that these systems really produce prosecutions without, or the outcome survivors want. And in fact, work on the increase in digital evidence in Canada has shown that the rise in evidence is still used even if survivors choose not to pursue a case. So the fact that this evidence is collected, systematized, and designed, once it's been consented to use by law enforcement, it's very hard for survivors to take the complaint out. And so the evidence can continue on even if the survivor is not there, which is deeply concerning and undermines agency, obviously. A fifth point I'll raise is around data protection practices, and we haven't talked about that so far in the talk, but we can raise it in Q&A. And I should just say that in the interest of individual privacy, these apps tend to erase important contextual features. And with all the data protection focusing on that dimension, they don't pay any attention really to how aggregate data sharing can actually strengthen oppressive systems. So for example, we've just seen this in the United States, but other places, where data brokerage companies are actually selling this aggregated data to law enforcement and border control agencies, precisely for the policing bodies who are already marginalized by the state. So in sum, our findings offer a really cautionary tale, we think, Concerns around these apps are not limited to, whether they do or don't work as intended, which is some of the discourse in Australia focused on with the consent app. But in this case, we've wanted to highlight, the bigger concern around how these techno-scientific interventions interact within these wider systems. And in this case, we've tried to point out these potential shifts and how they materialize in ways that actively reflect entangled cultural and material implications. And more specifically, we share concerns that these interventions, if perceived as a meaningful reform, might actually detract from the kinds of structural and systematic changes that need to be prioritized. And this is especially true given the fact that these apps are being deployed in spaces where there's no or very limited meaningful regulatory insight of the data itself and how it's used. And so we'll end on that point because we'd really like to hear what you all have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate, Jenna, and Renee in the US. And are there any questions that we have?
Or even, we'd love to hear other directions where you think this research can and should go as well, or other ideas if others have studied related issues.
I've got a question. Emma here. Just wondering whether you've investigated NGOs or the not-for-profits working in this sector and what sort of apps they're developing or producing in order to compete with these more profit-driven apps.
Yeah. I might start, and Renee, do you want to take over? And maybe Jenna, I don't know, because you looked really closely at the nonprofit ones as well.
Callisto.
Yeah, Callisto especially. Well, maybe I'll let you start with Callisto, and then I'll,
Sure. So I've only really looked at one particular app in depth that it would be considered an NGO, and I'm sure Renee could speak to this a little bit more, but with Callisto, they are at this point in time framing themselves as nonprofit driven, as an NGO, and as working, for survivors by survivors. But a deeper look at their structure, and actually a couple critical pieces on the internet have pointed out how it's actually misleading to claim that there are even NGOs at all, given that the platforms themselves actually require subscriptions. They get funding from not just survivors, but a bunch of funders, venture capitalists. So they are actually getting a decent amount of profit. So the term itself is misleading, but then they actually get to capitalize from that, claim that they are nonprofit oriented and that they are an NGO. Renee, I'm not sure if you have other comments on that.
Yeah, I would say, I do think it's important to highlight Callisto, especially in terms of reporting apps. They predated Me Too also, and were really held up as an early model for how to create reporting apps. And many people have replicated their the functionality of their algorithm. I would say there's a huge imbalance between nonprofit and for-profit technologies. The skew is just really huge. But as Jenna pointed to, even honestly, no other nonprofit ones immediately come to mind. But I think we should consider them as part of the nonprofit industrial complex and all the things that go into that. There are a couple other technologies or apps that, JDoe is an example where there's no cost to use it, but lawyers actually subscribe and fund it on their end so they can get access to the databases. And so I think that also creates really murky and potentially problematic funding sources that complicate something that may seem really kind of benign and, for the people. But if you kind of scratch beneath the surface, you find some like a funding structure that might make you feel really uncomfortable. It's a great question though.
It is a great question. And the other thing, the only thing I'd add is like in the development space, and this is something we really want to interrogate, is how grassroots organizations are interfacing with development agencies in terms of the design of some of these things, or with government as well. And that's something hopefully you could see some intervention that's productive in that space, but honestly, we haven't been able to drill down in the way that we would need to kind of verify a claim on that front.
Oh, I just wanted to add one more thing that I thought of, and this is, I can speak more confidently to it in terms of prevention technologies rather than reporting technologies, but within the prevention field, what I found is a lot of them are actually created on college campuses with actually some kind of corporate funding source on campus, or perhaps like a venture capitalist competition on campus where they come in and offer $50,000 to the best innovation. And so a number of these have started from young people working on college campuses. They get that corporate or venture capitalist funding, and then it spins off into kind of a bigger project. So that's another really interesting thread of how these things come to exist.
Now, Kate, Lena has posed a question in the comments. I'm not sure if you can see that, or that, I guess, for the three of you. Lena, would you like to speak to that at all?
Oh, sorry, Lena. No worries. So the question around looking at anonymous reporting apps and online processes in Australia with the police, not privately owned, and what drives to implement more of these. I mean, we've looked mostly at Hello Cast for this process, or this particular set of projects. I'd love to hear more, and I wish you had mic capabilities. But no, and I should say I've only returned to Australia last year. So learning more about this is something I'm really enthusiastic to do, and to hear what others are doing in this space as well. So I really can't, oh, Georgina Hayden, great. I'd love to see. I don't know, do you have any other comments on that? I mean, we've seen it in other contexts, but
yeah, in other contexts, I think.
But I don't know the specifics around Australia.
Mm-hmm.
I can very quickly add on the Australian one. The only thing I've seen, I'm not an expert. My background's more in domestic violence, and I was interested to hear what you're doing in this space to understand better whether we can do anything in that space as well. I know there's an overlap, but the New South Wales Police have recently, I read an article on this about reporting for so you might have heard the schools, what do you call it, what's her name, the girl who's living in the UK at the moment, is it Chantel, that came out with that oh gosh, the words are eluding me right now, the online, not survey, but she posted a change.org or something like that, and everyone's come up with stories of what's happened to them in their various schools. And the police have responded in New South Wales, is my understanding, by setting up a reporting system where young people, or I think anyone, but people can report who their offender was, and so they can keep track of that and see whether there were repeat offenders. And it's not an official report, if that makes sense. It's more of on an unofficial basis, but that's somewhat, so yeah. Lena knows what I'm talking about. She's got some names up there. Yeah, my apologies, I'm not all over it, but I felt like that was a really neat way of doing it. I'm not an expert, but at least there was some data collection on perpetrator names, and an ability to go back through time and check whether there are repeat offenders, and then potentially down the track, if there is a report, an official report, there's something, within the police system that enables women to take it forward. It also felt like it was done, again, this is just from the articles that I read, in a, what's the right word for this? Because I know in domestic violence, it's often done in a very demeaning way, particularly the questioning around what a woman's experienced. And this appeared to take that sort of issue into account, and done in a less obtrusive way. And I know that's particularly a problem for sexual violence, with women having to reshare their stories over and over again. And I'm not sure that it's even easier if it's on an app. I think it's still difficult. I did have another quick question for Renee. I was stunned to hear what you're saying. I'll quickly, I just came from a run, so I don't want to turn my video on. But, yeah, absolutely stunned that your comments around how oppressive this kind of reporting can be from someone who hasn't looked at it in much detail. I'm not really sure how to frame the question. Is there any way around this, I guess, is what I'm trying to ask? Or is that just how it is when we're talking about using technologies like this? Is it about the funding, the fact that it's being used to make profit, or are we just really at a dead end if we're trying to use these sorts of technologies to enable women not just to report, but to then leave situations and seek support safely?
That's a great question. So as a feminist, I like to believe that there's hope for the future. So I always like to leave open the possibility that we can build and imagine technologies that enable us to relate in ways that are, productive and promote equity, and refuse the kind of harms and problems of our existing world. So I am someone who always leaves that door open that we could create something. I think something that I feel strongly about is we're just not doing it now. And so I hope that, this work helps people see where we could improve things. And for me, one of the key problems with these, kind of beyond their kind of holistic endorsement of criminal legal responses, because I think that's extremely limiting in so many ways. We could talk about that all day, but also none of them really work to address precarity. None of them work to get people connected to financial, economic, shelter, any kind of situations that will meaningfully address their vulnerability to violence, and that we can actually use that as a foundational basis for building the kind of technologies that we like. And I think it was Donna Coker who wrote, she's a lat crit theorist in early 2000s, wrote an article on the materials test, where she was advocating that laws, policies, interventions into gender violence should prioritize increasing precarious persons' access to material resources. And I think we can apply that to this new technological world, that we can embrace that and figure out whatever our intervention is, it should foremost be doing that before it's doing anything else.
Yeah, I agree with you. Again, not an expert on either space, but I've always felt that technology can be used really powerfully, but it can be used well. It can also be used really badly, even just as educators, we see that. But I think even in this space, so I'll give you an example. With COVID-19, we know that domestic violence spiked during that time, but we also know that reports did actually increase during times like midnight to overnight, when women felt like they could report. And reading those articles, I felt like tech had a place to help women, because you can't usually speak to someone in the middle of the night, but at least you can do some kind of reporting. And ideally, if you had something set up, you could find the right places to go or seek help later on, but those sorts of systems, as far as I'm aware, are not really well set up in Australia anyway. And the DV services are, from my understanding, mainly, not tech-based, mainly face-to-face and during sort of office hours. Obviously, you can go to a women's shelter, but we're not always talking about that kind of extreme, I'm leaving right in this moment. There's a whole raft of things that can happen before that. But yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I learned a lot.
That's a really good point. And Jenna actually just raised a point that, there are some cases where we've looked at a couple apps that have tried to kind of strike a balance around this. And I should say, I'll turn it over to Jenna to discuss one of them, but, I should just say I was one of the people approached to be a consultant, or a group of us were approached to be a consultant around some of these apps. And while the app developer had all those concerns laid out and wanted to do it. Once they went to the police as a partner, the police asserted so much power and dominance over the design that they had to have access to all of the data. They needed to make sure it was legally cleared so they can access. So I'm actually sympathetic that I do think some designers and app developers do want to, address some of the things that you've raised. But once they engage with police organizations, that dynamic changes, and a lot of compromises, often need to happen. And again, this is a small n reflection that, mean they make these kinds of design choices in order to ensure they've got that partner involved. Now, Jenna actually just reminded me of one app that we found in Brazil that shows maybe a better balancing act. And so I'll let you share maybe some of the details of that.
Yeah, sure. So as Kate mentioned, there is one that we think, has potential. It could be promising. There is a bit of a language barrier and a lack of information on this app, so we haven't been able to parse out as much as we'd like. But it's really interesting because it's actually two sister organizations. So one is called Think Eva, which uses artificial intelligence to track harassing emails, texts, and comments, and to provide customer service to take care of the situation, whatever that actually means. And then their sister organization is called Think Olga, which is actually an NGO that tries to move away from that more technical side and actually try to work a little bit more on the structural shift, mainly through education. So if you go on their website, they offer tons of manuals, documentaries, videos that educate society on various types of harms related to sexual violence. And not just that, but as well as gendered inequities, inequities related to ableism, racism, and other things like that are highly interconnected with sexual violence. So it's really interesting that they try to have both a technical as well as educational component to tackling these issues. But we'll have to find out more in the future as to how it's actually being rolled out.
Yeah, and they're very well connected with local organizations and grassroots organizations to help provide support services in the absence of government resources. I mean, none of this will quote unquote work without structural change. I mean, there's no doubt about that, but you do see some feminist organizations, and that's a good example of which, we are seeing some kind of mobilization where the app serves as a pathway to more holistic or different kinds of resources beyond criminal legal ones.
And I think it's also really interesting that they explicitly upfront emphasize intersectionality as a key approach and mindset to trying to grapple with these issues. Whereas other organizations, I would say, would capitalize upon major events that maybe deal with race or gendered issues, but kind of only do them in these short frame temporal types of responses, whereas Think Eva and Think Olga through and through try to weave intersectionality in all the work that they do, including their promotional material that's available online.
Any other questions forthcoming? Well, perhaps as the only white male in the room, so to speak, I feel I should say something. And what you're doing is you're looking at the after event, in a sense. What would you like to do to men, so to speak? And I say that, I mean, just the other, not 48 hours ago, we had a young woman burnt to death by her estranged partner here in Queensland. So, we see these, and everyone says, oh, it doesn't happen in our backyard, but it obviously does. So what sort of, like, to get back to the original, when Sally and I were talking about who might talk about this, that stupid app, that stupid intervention from the New South Wales Chief Commissioner said, oh, this will sort it all out. You'll be able to press a button and consent will be, will be officially recorded. And since then we've had this absolutely monstrous $3.5 million ad, which you may or may not have seen in the US, but we can forward it to you. It's just this most bizarre thing, intervention. So what part do men, as you know, some people like the mad fucking witches on Twitter say, don't rape women. Apart from saying that, what else can men, what other advice can you give to men?
Well, the first thing that I wanted to respond to is that we should also not forget that men also experience sexual violence. And one of the things that these apps and most technologies do is continue to hide that, because they're so gendered and their imagined user is so gendered and cisgendered. And so all sorts of people kind of get left out of the framing. So, if these technologies, truly embrace intersectionality and if they approach the issue with a little bit more care and didn't focus as heavily on kind of this gendered imagining, I think that would make them more useful. But perhaps this also is related to the previous question, is I think that apps in general should approach their interventions through a transformative justice lens. And that can look many different ways and would bring men into the fold, into the response, and in terms of how they can, support this issue, work to change the culture, intervene at all levels, interpersonal, community, and structural, like wherever people feel like that they may fit in. But that until the theory of justice that these technologies adopt shifts, we're never going to get there. So for me, I'm like, I want to take it even one step higher and say, like, they have to embrace a transformative justice model. I don't know if Kate and Jenna, if you have different or additional thoughts to add on.
No, and my only point that I would add to that is that you're absolutely right about survivors, but we do know the vast majority of perpetrators are men, and there are ways that men can hold other men accountable in those circuits, in those networks. But that is, just one piece, of course. But I won't go on because I think that's a great response.
And Kate, we have another question from Lena, so you might have to read that because she can't talk.
I mean, that's like a whole separate talk, right? But I mean, we could do a long talk about network governance and go ahead, Renee, you're going to jump in.
Well, I don't want to overstep you, but maybe this will give you food for thought, Kate, is that actually, Lena, the argument that you laid out has been made by technology inventors for decades now. When I did some separate prior research on, the wearable technologies, looking all the way back, from the 60s and traced, where those designs came from. But from the, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, while people were making technologies all throughout that time, the comment was, well, things are really bad and we can't fix the social structure. So people need a lifeline, which I think makes sense. You don't just want to leave everyone out to dry while we figure things out at a structural level. People do need, support systems. But the fact that we're still saying that 40 years later makes me think that we should figure out a way, work together to imagine something so 40 years from now we aren't having the same conversation.
Yeah, and that's probably a good summary point, because we've seen such violence in other spaces too, and everyone talks about it and yet uses it to market, no, the solution will work this time. Band-aids, exactly. Yeah. And there are ways, imagine if a powerful tech actor were to intervene and say, no, this is irresponsible. It would have a powerful force, but instead, like, I would argue that the capitalistic push in this respect, you know, continues to incentivize, or the data capitalism push continues to incentivize these kinds of interventions, whereas, you know, they could opt out and focus on other markets. You know, they do it all the time.
Okay, Lean has just made another little 3-word comment, which mandates, but if there are no other questions, are there any other questions?
I don't have a question, but I just want to say thank you, because it's such important work. It's frightening to think that it's all about the criminal side of it. So what are the victims actually gaining by using these acts? Aside from maybe the perpetrator getting behind bars, but all of those sort of short-term immediate needs don't appear to be getting met by those acts. That's my takeaway from this talk. Is that correct?
That's a great summary. Better than ours. We might need that as our public statement.
Lucky I recorded it, because I can't remember what I just said. But okay, yeah. Which is frightening. And there was something that I think it may have been Lena that was saying about, and my brain's going to stop functioning. Something she said, I thought, really, we haven't moved on from that? It's been 30 years since I know someone was in this situation, and we're still, was it the one that just turned a video on and came back from a job? She was saying this is to do with domestic violence, not, yeah. So anyway, it's frightening.
Yeah. The women reporting, is that what?
Oh no, the through the day, the 9 to 5, the business hours.
Yeah,
really? We're
having
still
support,
there?
having supports outside of, I mean, even just having 9 to 5 supports is.
Yeah, but I mean, what happened? People could be working and not able to use those, which was what was happening 30 years ago. So I'm gobsmacked that those supports are still only kind of business hour models, and still only majority face-to-face, and it's quite frightening.
Oh, look, don't quote me on all of that. I'm sure I'm not an expert on all that, but I do still feel there's a space for tech to come in and fill gaps. There's a lot of strain definitely on DV services in Australia. That's a fact, people-wise and funding-wise. But just to respond to, can I quickly respond to that question on what the men can do from a DV perspective? I mean, where to start? What a huge question. And especially following the news overnight. This is now that there's been so many, but the most recent case that's been in the news, Kelly Wilkinson, takes me back to Hannah Clark. That was this time last year, who was another Australian woman. I mean, I don't know where to start on that. First of all, men need to stop abusing women, obviously. But for men who aren't abusing women, who are bystanders, we all know men. So yes, I know it's not all men, but all men, I think, have a part to play. And I think one of the things with this is it makes so many men uncomfortable. Nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody really wants to address it. You see a lot of women everywhere I go doing this. I see a lot of women involved. And so it's just great to even see you here, Roger, like to have a man in the call. But I think that makes men uncomfortable, and they need to start facing that and look themselves right in the mirror and go, this shouldn't make me feel uncomfortable anymore. They need to start calling out their friends for bad jokes, all the little.
Yeah.
In my defence, I'm in charge of putting this together. But all I could say is that I would be here if I wasn't putting it together anyway.
Yeah, but you know, I think.
Sally, oh sorry.
That, well, I was just going to say, it just goes to show, though. I mean, this is what I see time and time again, and men need to start to step up everywhere. And,
Sally, oh sorry.
Like all men, like, you know, like my husband as well, you know, everyone.